Association of Business Economists, or NABE. Peter, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you very much, Shane. Thank you, Fred. It's good to be a part again of our users conference. This will be, I believe, my fourth users conference now, and I've always enjoyed the in-person. I look forward to getting back to that next year. But for now, I'm happy to present some of the work that we did here in this virtual setting. Just by way of introduction, on August 4th, Missouri voters were the latest to approve a ballot measure to expand the state's Medicaid program, in this case called Mo HealthNet or Missouri HealthNet. And this expansion would make all adults below 65 eligible for Medicaid if they're earning 138% of the federal poverty level or less. And that was estimated to increase the eligible population by about 230,000, which actually represents almost 4% of the state's total population. So this presentation discusses how REMI was brought in to analyze the prospective economic impact of that kind of expansion, specifically with regards to how the new federal funding that would flow into the state and kind of the results of our study. So I'll just mention briefly our team. I was the principal investigator. I was joined by Kyle Compton as project manager. Jeffrey Dykes was one of our analysts, and William Kozlowski was another one. We had a great team. We also worked very closely with some researchers at Washington University that I'll talk about shortly. So just a little bit of background. REMI was connected by the Fairness Project with the Missouri Foundation for Health, or MFH. And MFH retained us to estimate the economic impact of increased federal funding associated with Medicaid expansion in Missouri, again, in anticipation of that August 4th ballot measure. So REMI relied on objective analysis from doctors Abigail Barker and Timothy McBride from Washington University in St. Louis's Center for Health Economics and Policy for the direct inputs to REMI of monetary flows to the state and how and where they were spent. And REMI and CHEP data, we use CHEP data to estimate impacts to the state as a whole, as well as to estimate impacts to communities outside of the Kansas City and St. Louis areas, impacts by industry, impacts by race, and by, quote, quality job for the period 2022 through 2026. Specifically, Drs. Barker and McBride estimated several key factors. First, how much federal funding would flow into the state as a result of Medicaid expansion. Now, starting this year, the federal match percentage moved down to 90% and will remain there, on a permanent basis. Second, how much of the state's current Medicaid spending will be offset and thereby freed up for other uses by that federal money. We modeled this, just parenthetically, we modeled this by increasing state government spending in kind of other areas of the budget. But it could also be modeled in a variety of other ways, including cutting taxes. And I'll have a brief discussion of what the differences would be when I get to the results. And then the remaining money from the federal government would represent new healthcare spending in the state from the new Medicaid eligible population. Third, how would the new Medicaid eligible population, and therefore that new healthcare spending, be distributed across the state according to the 6 Department of Social Services regions, which you can see in the map on the right side of the slide. So that is the St. Louis and Kansas City metro areas in kind of blue and purple. And then the remaining sectors of the state, the Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, and Southeast. We then worked with Drs. Barker and McBride to determine the distribution of that new healthcare spending across different types. And we ended up distributing it across consumer spending on doctors, dentists, hospitals, nursing homes, and pharmaceuticals, according to the underlying distribution of spending in those categories in the REMI baseline. This provided us with all the appropriate data to model the total impact of the federal funding associated with Medicaid expansion, accounting, again, for both the freed up state funds and the new healthcare spending. So this is just, for all of you, I think are pretty familiar, down at the bottom, representing some of our many clients. And so many of you know what makes this great, kind of the combination of several different, modeling methodologies has kept us at the forefront of economic impact modeling over the last 4 decades. So now I'll turn to the results. So as I discussed, our analysis considered 2 main factors, that net new healthcare spending and the savings in state government spending that gets reallocated to other parts of the budget in spending. So over the 2022 through 2026 period, the increased demand for the healthcare sector and reallocated state government spending increases Missouri employment by over 16,000 jobs in an average year, with the impact growing over time. And just a brief kind of technical note, we did convert the employment impact into kind of full-time equivalent jobs. If you were to run this analysis and look at what is directly spit out of REMI, of course, our employment definition follows the BEA, where part and full-time jobs are counted equally. But we did make that conversion in this case. Closely tied to the increase in employment is, of course, the increase in economic activity in the state, as measured by an average of $2.5 billion in total economic output and $1.6 billion in gross state product. Missourians also will see an aggregate increase of over $1 billion in personal income, about $1.1 billion. And so that's at the state level, and underneath these aggregate results, we do find important distributional results along several dimensions that kind of demonstrate the different facets of value of that federal funding associated with expanding Medicaid in Missouri. So the first dimension I'd like to explore is geographical. As I discussed, we split the state into the 6 Missouri Department of Social Services regions that break out the 4 quadrants of the state, as well as St. Louis and Kansas City. And we find that the impacts are not just concentrated in those 2 major cities, but really across the state, with almost 2/3 of the new jobs created outside of St. Louis and Kansas City, and over 2,000 jobs created in each of 5 of the 6 regions. So only one of the regions sees a relatively smaller employment impact, of course, still positive. Now, the reason that these impacts are distributed robustly across the state is that the demand for healthcare is usually highly local, especially for primary care doctors and dentists. And as such, when people's demand for healthcare rises, the demand is largely satisfied by providers from within their respective region. Is there somebody who's not on mute? I just want to make sure it's not distracting to the audience. Thank you. This is also true for hospitals, though to a somewhat lesser extent, as St. Louis and Kansas City combined do see just over half of the increases in hospital jobs. And this is a result of having larger regional hospitals that see more patients from around the state. Now, you may note that the Northeast region has the largest jobs impact, and that is driven by the assumption that the state's revenue savings are spent, which is associated with an increase in state public sector employment in Jefferson City, which is located in that region. If the savings were instead utilized to lower taxes, which is certainly also quite plausible, then the job impacts would be even more evenly distributed across the regions. driven by increased consumer spending activity from the rise in disposable personal income that accompanies the lower taxes, as opposed to increased government spending directly. That's more concentrated. The second dimension I'd like to explore is industrial. Of course, the key impetus of expanding the Medicaid in Missouri is to widen access to and therefore demand for healthcare. And we see an average of about 1,900 jobs created in the ambulatory healthcare sector, which includes primary care doctors and dentists, and about 1,100 jobs created in the private hospital sector, as well as a smaller number of jobs in nursing homes and the pharmaceutical industry. However, expanding Medicaid also has significant impacts outside the healthcare sector, with almost 4 out of 5 of the new jobs created in a wide variety of non-healthcare industries. You can see this reflected in the pie chart, as the 3 categories at the top right represent the newly created healthcare sector jobs, and the remainder represents the newly created jobs outside the healthcare sector. Now, there are several reasons for this. First, the savings in state revenue being reallocated into new spending does create significant public sector employment, potentially including in education, transportation, public safety, and other arenas that are under the purview of the state government. And this can be seen in the pie chart in the state and local government section, which is the largest section there in red. Second, the new public sector and healthcare jobs lead to a wide variety of associated jobs. These include those in the construction sector, as the growth in economic activity spurs commercial investment, as well as residential investment from the out-of-state population that moves in to take up the newly created jobs. And the new construction jobs, the new construction jobs can also be seen there in the pie chart. Associated jobs are also created in the retail sector, which you can see graphically as well, as the increase in personal income drives more consumer spending activity, much of it via retailers. Of course, it remains to be seen how in-person retailers come out of the COVID crisis, but this should remain a significant impact. Also, all of these jobs and their associated economic activity rely, of course, on their suppliers, from wholesalers to professional services to materials manufacturing. So the increase in economic activity also creates demand for more jobs in the supply chains of all these industries. And finally, I just want to address some of the kind of equity or distributional implications. First, almost 9 in 10 of the new jobs created are what we denoted as quality jobs in industries that pay full-time workers above $15 per hour, which is, of course, a major focal point for the national discussion around what constitutes a living wage. Also, just about 1 in 6 of the new jobs go to members of the Black, Asian, Hispanic, and other minority communities. And finally, if we distribute the more than $1 billion in new personal income created across all Missouri households, that comes out to an average of about $500 per household, which is especially in our current times, can be quite valuable. Of course, there will be some kind of distribution around that average, but certainly it's a robust average given our times. So, in just to summarize, by increasing Missourians' ability to demand the healthcare services that they need, and by freeing space in the state budget, expanding Medicaid in Missouri, at least with regards to the federal funding that comes in, it does show strong positive economic and equity impacts across all regions, industries, and populations in the state. I will note that we did not factor in any kind of federal budget or other considerations, so those remain on the table as well. This was focused just on the state, but in that context, it showed strong, positive, and kind of robustly distributed impacts. So with that, I'll turn things over back to Shane. Thank you, Shane.